Welcome to the Kingdom Educators podcast, where we empower Christian teachers to grab a hold of heaven's hope-filled perspective so you can activate transformational impact in your classroom and community. I'm your host, Jesica Glover, and I warmly welcome you to wake up to your strategic placement as a kingdom educator, anointed by the Creator and equipped by all of heaven to release the radical goodness of God that will transform lives and reshape education. Well, welcome back to the Kingdom Educators podcast, where we equip Christian teachers to see their classrooms as places of calling, formation, and kingdom influence in everyday rhythms of education. Today's conversation is both timely and incredibly important. I'm joined by Billy Hutchinson, director of the Colson Educators at the Colson Center. Billy spent more than a decade serving in Christian education as both a teacher and administrator, helping schools pursue academic excellence while intentionally cultivating Christian worldview formation in both students and educators. Today, Billy leads Colson Educators, an initiative of the Colson Center that exists to help teachers faithfully live out their faith in education and bring a distinctly Christian worldview into the classroom with clarity, confidence, and courage. So before we get into that conversation, I always love starting here, because behind every calling is a story. And as most of us know this particular season of the podcast, we've been focusing on Romans 8:28, that God wastes nothing in our stories, but he works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. So here on this podcast, we talk about our identity as kingdom carriers, working with God in our classrooms on mission with Jesus. In fact, I sometimes refer to our role as porta temples of the Holy Spirit. And I believe God is forming something powerful in educators right now, teachers who are learning to see their classrooms not simply as places of instruction, but as places where students encounter truth, hope, goodness, and ultimately the reality of God's presence. So today we're going to begin with Billy's story, how God has shaped his journey through education, leadership, and worldview formation. And then we'll move into a conversation about Christian worldview in the classroom, what it really means, why it matters in today's cultural moment, and how educators can live it out in practical, thoughtful, and courageous ways. So whether you're teaching in public school, private school, homeschool setting, or serving in educational leadership, I believe this conversation is going to encourage and challenge you today. So Billy, welcome to the Kingdom Educators podcast.
Jesica, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So I'd love to start we've been talking a lot about God writing our story. So I always love starting here. How has God written education into your story? How has it become part of your story?
Yeah, if you would have asked me probably in high school if I'd be in this position, I would have probably said no. I did want to teach. I had no clue that it would be in this capacity, but I always was one of those students that I just loved to learn, and education came easy for me until I got to college because I had some really bad habits I had to undo. But I just always had this desire to teach history. I'm fascinated by history. I love history. And so I went through high school, was involved in a youth group in East Tennessee. And most of the stuff that we did it was positive peer pressures, late 80s, early 90s. It was pizza parties. It was, you're not really wrestling with ideas of worldview formation. It's just not what it was at that time. Mm-hmm. And then I went to college, and as I'm pursuing teaching, and I kind of thought, well, maybe this is not the right thing for me. So I flirted with biology for a little bit, and then I was like, no, I don't want to do that. And then I really just floundered for a little while. And while I was in college, I really struggled with a couple of classes, one of which at the college I was at in East Tennessee, it was a history of Christianity. And I thought, okay, I grew up in the church and this will be an easy A for me. And I walked in and the professor said, I'm here to tell you how Christianity is one of the greatest hoaxes of all time. We'll look at it from not from a religious perspective. And I'm here to dismantle everything that you think is true about Christianity. And I was like, okay, this is something completely different.
Okay.
And so my faith was shaken in those ways. I wouldn't say that I walked away from the faith, but I had unfortunately, what we call a typical college experience for many, and really struggled with what is it like to live out the Christian faith in college. And I began to wrestle with questions of the problem of evil and is the Bible true, and questions of gender and all these things. And It was at that moment that I realized I don't want other people's story to be the same as my story. And at that point, God really moved within my heart and within my understanding of calling to really move me to study apologetics and to
Okay.
really work to equip high school students and college students to not have that abandonment of the faith. You're looking at these numbers that are coming out of students that are walking away, and just really felt that God was moving me to equip high school students and college students. And so I just began this desire to teach. I was working in a retail environment at the time. I was attending a church in Charlotte, and as those two kind of converge together, I'm completing seminary, and a job opens up at the church. Had a school there, and they said, "Hey, we want somebody that's going to not just teach the Bible, but teach students how to think critically and study philosophy. And so you've been teaching our college ministry for a while now. What do you think?" And I thought, this is the opportunity. So I stepped into that role, and I was there for about 12 and a half years. Started as just a Bible teacher, and by the time that I left, I served as the Dean of Academics, Worldview, Formation, and Digital Instruction. And so I began not just informing how things happen in my classroom, but I was impacting what was happening in the Bible department and then other departments in the high school and then departments in the middle school and the elementary school. And as they all work together, and then the institution at large. And while I was doing that, I was doing some contract work for the Colson Center,
Oh,
and
wow.
then they offered me the position in January of 2025. And so looking
Okay.
back on those moments of decisions that I thought that I had just made without consulting God or just willy-nilly, if you will, that God was moving me in a direction that I didn't even know at the time through some of the things that I had experienced, some of the questions that I had, some of the just those life moments that we go through. And so
Yeah.
you're right, like Romans 8:28. Now we have to be careful that we keep that in the context of the entire thing of the book. And you're looking at specific calling and how that verse is specifically for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And we can look back and see that nothing is wasted
Mm.
in God's sovereignty as he forms us for the calling that I have today and the calling that I will have 5 years from now, 10 years from now, until he calls me home.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm curious with you stepping into this role, and it sounds like really the heart behind going into education was to help equip, like you said, students to understand, like, when I say yes to Jesus, I'm not just, that's not it. I'm like versed in the word. It covers me. I know what it says. Have you seen, and I know my question says, is God, how he's shown you how he's actually leading that path? Is there a story or results you've seen where kids have come back and said, "Hey, Billy, this is me," or they probably call you Mr. Hutchinson, excuse me. But what have they said where you're like, "Oh my gosh, this really has made a difference in
Oh
kids'
yeah.
lives
I
and their
mean,
faith?" Yeah.
there are plenty of stories that I could share with you just because that I wasn't the type of teacher that just wanted to roll the ball out. I'm like kids didn't want to take my class. They were
Mhm.
terrified because I wanted them to write papers and I didn't give a lot of multiple choice questions because I wanted them to wrestle with the ideas. And I had a number of students that would tell me, I really hated your class. You were fine to deal with, but I really just hated the what you made us do and the work that you, and I wasn't trying to make it like seminary,
Yeah.
although I've been accused of numerous occasions. But then they said it wasn't until I got to college. And then I went, oh, wait a minute. He really did care for us. He
Mhm.
made us do hard things because he knew there were hard things ahead of us and he wanted us to be prepared. And my favorite stories, I had a student that went to a pretty large evangelical university, and her teacher called her in and said, "We think you're cheating." And she was like, "Nope, here's my notes from my Bible class in high school." And this is how serious he took it. And she was tutoring other students who
Okay.
were walking away and having some really tough conversations going, I don't know how to deal with this, but I can't talk to this professor. And she's, well, I'm able to walk through some of this with you because this guy poured into me. So, and what was really interesting for me is that after spending time in the classroom and just mentoring students in that way, I began to look around at my peers. And when you work in a Christian school environment, we're all believers, but there were so many that would come to me and say, "Hey, I don't know how to talk about this. This came up in my class today, and I really am, and I want to be equipped. So how do we do that?" And that gave me a heart to now not only mentor the students, but not that I had it figured out for teachers by any means, but that's where God really identified a calling for me to say, hey, let's not just do this for students. Let's work with your peers to equip them to see things in some different ways that your life experiences has helped you to do that. And so I was able to step into some of those roles and just from my seminary training and some other pieces to say, hey, let's talk about what worldview formation is,
Yeah.
because what we find, and it's true, is that many teachers think I teach the Bible, therefore I teach a Christian worldview. And those two statements are not the same thing.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'm excited to get further into this conversation because I think a lot of us coming from public education, I've never been to seminary and I've never done all these things, but we may have had different experiences, different people listening of studying the word, but maybe not in the same way. And so this is exciting to have this conversation. How has your understanding of your calling shifted over time? And if you feel like we already answered that, that's fine.
No, I think really I had thought of calling, like many people think of calling, as occupational. What am I going to do for my life? And honestly, it wasn't until about, even though that I'd transitioned in the role of teaching and doing some professional development at schools, it wasn't until really I had started engaging with the Colson Center that really reframed my understanding of calling.
Wow.
And it did this through four questions. So we have a documentary series. It's called Truth Rising, and there's a documentary with Oz Guinness and some other folks. But then there's a study that you can do after this. And the particular question of calling, this is about the third iteration of how we've done this from the Colson Center. But it asks us four questions. We're encouraged to ask us four questions. The first question is, what is good that I can celebrate? Then what is broken that I can fix? What is missing that I can create, and what is evil that I can stop? And when I began to really think through those questions, then I began to think through that calling was not something that I did as an occupation, but calling was more existential in that it was who I am as an individual. And so now if you took those four questions and you could apply them to any context,
Mhm.
if you're a public school teacher in a first grade classroom, you can look around and say, because those questions aren't inherently religious, you could say, hey, what is something good we can celebrate about in our classroom here? What is something evil that we can look to stop? What is something missing that we can look to create? And what is something that's broken that we can fix? And then we begin to see people's worldview commitments underneath that as
Right.
they define what is worth celebrating, what is worth fixing, and what is worth stopping. And then how do we do those things? And so that's really where I began to think through calling and how my understanding of calling shifted from being the old adage that we know, you go to some sort of social function, they ask you, what's your name, then what do you do? And that was to identify who you are. But now, if we think about calling and those four questions again, and then we realize that God has ordained the time and places in which you and I live. And so now that He's put us in this time and in this place and in this context, to really look through those questions of what is good that we can celebrate, what is broken that we can fix, what is evil we can stop, what's missing that we can create. And as we live according to God's decree that we're here in this time and place, and we live out those questions, then that becomes so much more of a sense of calling than what am I going to do from an occupational standpoint. I know it's probably a really long answer, but that's what I
That's
got.
that's good. That's good. So on actually last week's conversation was with a gal who's done a lot of work with Jamie Winship. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he talks a lot about identity. And we have a lot of teachers on here who have worked with identity. So asking the father, what is my identity? More than the etymology of my name or being a
Mhm.
son or daughter of God, what is it that I bring to an atmosphere when I'm in a place? And I appreciate the questions that you just shared because I think it brings another level of intentionality and me like walking in the fullness of how God made me, because we truly believe each one of us is very unique, designed, and that we bring something different to a classroom, because that's what we're talking about, than each other. And that's a gift to those children, to their parents, to the colleagues that we're rubbing shoulders with. But I like those questions because it like nudges it even deeper to go, okay, in this space, how am I fully me doing these things? So I'm going to definitely put those in the show notes, just listeners, so you
Yeah,
know
please
that.
do. And
Yeah.
that calling module is actually the fourth module, and the third
Okay.
module is the module on identity.
Okay.
And in that identity
Awesome.
module, we discuss the four relationships that were established in the garden, but then they're broken by the fall, and then they're redeemed by the work of Christ. And what we see those four relationships are they're upward with God, inward with ourselves,
Yeah.
outward with others and downward with creation. And so as we think about those relationships, then our ultimate identity is anchored in the fact that we bear the Imago Dei and that we are stewards of the Imago Dei as well. And so what does it look like and what does it mean to be human? But then when we look at any of those problems that are in those four questions that I provided on calling, we have to ask the question of, well, so which one of these relationships is expressed in this? And is our solution actually going to repair that relationship, or is it something completely different and off base?
Okay. Wow, that's awesome. I'm excited to go take a look at that myself. Very cool. What has God taught you, Billy, through the different seasons of your leadership journey?
That's a really good question. I think the probably the biggest lesson that any leader can learn is humility and what it means. And I'm not saying that I've been out and out your knee cut off at the knees, humbled, but you can't walk into spaces thinking that you know everything because you don't know everything and you don't know everybody and you don't know their story. And so one of the biggest lessons that I've learned about leadership is humility, and the second one is gratitude. And so, how that you never lead from a position of power. This idea of positional leadership it's shallow, it's not effective, it's not the biblical model that we see in servant leadership. But what does it mean to lead with a sense of humility, but also with a sense of gratitude that God has surrounded you with people that He's going to allow you to influence? And that idea would be that you give that away so that they can replicate that among themselves and people that come after them. It's just a discipleship model. And we say this a whole lot around the Colson Center with the Colson educators that teachers don't just transmit information, they reproduce who they are. And so that
Yes.
is not
Yeah.
just from a worldview standpoint, but from a leadership standpoint. Some of the greatest lessons I've learned about leadership have not been because I've taken an executive leadership C suite class. It's been because I've observed people or I've read history books about how people have, succeeded, have been successful leaders or been abject failures at
Yeah.
leadership. And so, again, the two things really is humility and gratitude.
That's so good. Yeah. And I just think about too, I'm sure a lot of the listeners can relate to, we've seen administrators come and go who are people that we'd want to emulate and others we would not. And taking those pieces that we do really appreciate and executing those character traits in our classrooms. And if we move up into other positions to be able to use those, that's really good. I appreciate that. Well, I'm excited to move into Christian worldview questions here. Let's dive in. When you say Christian worldview, how do you define that in a way where teachers can actually live out, not just academically understand that term?
Yeah, it's a really important question because we want to make sure that we're using the same language and meaning the same words by it. And so when I think about the term Christian worldview, one of my seminary professors, this has been the most impactful definition for me. And he says that a worldview, his name's Dr. Mark Liederbach at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. He said a worldview is a system of beliefs by which we perceive, interpret, and judge reality. And I think if we break that down into those three pieces, because we think about application, yeah, worldview stuff can be extremely heady and it can be way out there in the abstract. But when we think about how our worldview informs how we perceive something. So, what does it mean to perceive something? If I'm made aware of a sound or something like that, right? Then what does it mean that we interpret something? We have to make sense of whatever we have perceived, and then we have to judge whether or not it is good, bad, wrong, whatever. If I'm in my home and it's 2 o'clock in the morning and I hear a noise, then I have perceived something. Now I have to interpret it. And is it one of my crazy cats that have knocked something off, or is it somebody trying to break into my home? And depending upon how I perceive it and interpret it, now I have to judge it, and it's going to force me into a particular action. So when we think about a worldview, every worldview is going to make a statement about truth, about reality, about ethics, what's good and bad, not just the morality of what specifically, but ethics, why something is good or bad, what human beings are, and who God is. And if every worldview has those components in it, then what happens now is everything that we make is from a worldview perspective. So if you're a public school teacher, every novel that you use is written from some sort of worldview. You just have to think through what are the right questions that I could ask and then begin to engage with that. And so
Mm.
when you think about a worldview, yes, it can be extremely heady and it can be extremely abstract, but at the end of the day, our worldview determines how we perceive something, how we interpret something, and how we judge and act accordingly. to it. And so if we see this in our culture all the time, the argument over abortion is not whether it is wrong to kill a human being. The argument is the entity in the womb of a human being. And that is a worldview question. And so that impacts how we live our lives out, because if we all start from different worldviews that we may not even be aware that we have, but they're going to either consciously or subconsciously move us in certain directions. And so that's why I'm all in on worldview formation and worldview engagement, because it's the undercurrent that is controlling the waves that we are continually responding to in culture.
Yeah. Why do you feel okay? So you kind of answered this already, but I'm thinking you might have something else to add. So, worldview formation is very critical right now in K 12 education. Could you speak more to that?
Yeah, so everybody has a worldview, and when I give our professional development offerings, I do it in three ways, three sessions. The first session is, as the teacher, you're the communicator of the worldview. Like, of your worldview, you are the communicator. And here's my Baptist training with all these C's I'm getting ready to alliterate. But you're the source of clarity. You're the source of confidence. You are the source of courage, and you are the understanding of, when it comes to that worldview, is this right or wrong? And you're conveying that to your students. But every textbook is also written from a perspective of a worldview. And so now you've got the teacher who's teaching a textbook that's written from a worldview that may line up together. They may not line up together. And so you've got the living curriculum and the physical curriculum. And then you also have the campus culture is a manifestation of the worldview of the administrators, the student body, everybody as a whole. So when we think about worldview, it moves and impacts so much of what happens on our campuses beyond just, well, here's this textbook and it's written from a naturalistic perspective, and I don't agree with that. Okay, well, you need to learn how to engage with it. But everything else that happens on that campus is also affected by our worldviews. And so therefore, if we're going to impact students and impact institutions, we have to get at the very bottom, which is where you change the worldview, you engage with the worldview, and it'll change what happens down the road. But if you just start here and don't address the worldview, then it's just going to come back around again.
Now, I'm just thinking for well, it might be newer teachers or teachers that are moving to new subjects this over the summer and moving into new things. Sometimes they get really overwhelmed by, okay, which thing do I focus on? I know I'm a light on a hill
Mhm.
in the world of public education in particular. I might be also in my Christian school. It depends on where we're at. But I, how do I start that? And more than you just telling me, Jesus, help me. How
Yeah,
would you
that's
help? Yeah. What would you give them for a practical, okay, start here?
Yeah. So what I would first do is that you can't, I said this earlier, you can't give away what you don't have. So you need to know what a worldview is. I would encourage public school teachers, private school teachers, whoever, to look at our worldview formation courses on Colson Educators. They're free. You get CEUs from ACSI. Some of them are going to be Bible, some of them will be education. And it really is going to give you an understanding of, okay, so how is a belief formed to begin with? What are beliefs and how are they formed? And then how do worldviews shape our beliefs? And again, you don't have to dive in and get super, super deep on, okay, so what is a postmodern worldview and all these pieces? You certainly can. But when you're looking at just the bare simplicity of it, okay, so when we talk about nature, it's either natural or it's supernatural. Either God exists or it all came from nothing. Those are two worldview questions. And so there's some resources on Colson Educators that really walk you at it's a simple but not simplistic level to say, okay, how do when I begin to read something or I listen to a song, what are some things that I can listen for to pick up on to go, oh, wait a minute, here's a worldview that might be embedded in this textbook and how that they frame this argument, or this worldview might be in that song that I didn't even realize that is the number one song in America right now, or this movie may be written from this worldview. And once you begin to see those things, then you see them everywhere. And so
Mhm.
it doesn't become such an academic exercise as much as it is an observational exercise to say, wait a minute, I just saw this movie and this question of are people good or evil inherently? Or I just read this book. When you read something like Lord of the Flies and you get to the end, you get into it and go, okay, so what's the question that's being asked here? It's, what is the nature of humanity? What will human beings gravitate towards? And so then you begin to ask follow-up questions. So it doesn't have to be necessarily an overtly religious exercise in public schools. I think if you are a public school teacher and you want to move them towards understanding the Christian worldview, I think you number one, start with critical thinking. That you begin to teach them how to ask questions of, okay, so how do we know this is true? According to who? What is the argument that they have put forth here to say that this is true? And how do we know that's actually right and true? And you begin to ask those questions, not from a perspective to go, let's subvert everything. This is education. Education is supposed to direct us into finding out what is true and how do we know it.
Yeah.
And those two questions, they're so powerful in terms of how you can engage with individuals.
Yeah. Yeah. And it makes me think too about our own kids have come home. They've taken an ethics class in high school, but why there's a big push and has been for years anyway around critical thinking. And so asking these kinds of questions is not just teaching kids how to assimilate information the way it's given, but to really contextualize it and figure out where is it coming from and all those things rather than almost dumbing it down.
Oh, yeah.
But
And
thinking of the
here's the
heart
thing,
behind.
Jessica, the College Board, whether good or bad, has given us something that's really helpful here. When I was in the classroom, I taught a number. I taught AP psychology, but two classes that I really enjoyed teaching were AP seminar and AP caps. So I taught the AP capstone, AP seminar, AP research.
Okay.
And in the AP seminar, as part of their exam at the very end, they had to read an excerpt and they had to answer 3 questions. And we put these questions in every class from 6th grade all the way up because I think they get at the essence of what we're doing. So God's common grace here, as the College Board is as liberal as they may be in some areas, they had students read something that said, number 1, what is the author's main idea, argument, or thesis? Number 2, explain their line of reasoning. Number 3, evaluate the effectiveness in their evidence in making the claim. If we could get students to think through those questions, it doesn't matter what they're reading.
Yeah.
And if we can get them to write to where they do the inverse of that, clearly state your claim, clearly explain your line of reasoning, clearly evaluate your evidence, then truth is going to win. And so we can now begin to look at any sort of textbook and say, okay, so what argument is this person making? What assumptions are being made as they move from point A to point B to point C? And again, it's just critical thinking. And it's hard to do because we're lazy as human beings. But if we can begin to do that, then now you can do that with any movie, any piece of music, and it's forming our worldview as we're asking those questions of what's good, what's real, what's true, what's beautiful.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. Yeah. And encouraging kids constantly to be active with text, not just passive. Wow. I love that. The College Board requires those and taking it down to the younger grades in the school that you were at, because it's not like kids can't think deeply. They do
Yeah. I mean, one
naturally.
of the favorite things to do with that is take it completely out of an academic context. And we said, all right, so who's the greatest of all time? Michael Jordan or LeBron James? And you'd have kids that would be fighting at the lunch tables. No, here's the argument. And you can't count that evidence. It was a different NBA back then. You're going, okay, I'm just smiling because when you guys are getting it, you're evaluating evidence, you're making claims, you're doing those things. And so that is the pursuit of truth is such an essential component of a worldview. And when we are using things like AI, we're outsourcing that. And we're saying, look, there's bias in these things. And I'm not anti-AI. I'm not pro-AI. I'm like, here are things that we have to be aware of. And when we're outsourcing, education and learning are 2 different things.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So I'm just thinking about different subjects here. What would it look like to bring Christian worldview into math, to science, to the reading classroom in a practical way?
So we have a newsletter from the Colson Educators called The Planning Period. Now, I don't know exactly when this is going to air because we're getting ready to put out the last episode for the summer, which is going to be in a couple of days, which will be a liturgy of rest for the weary teacher, like telling you to do here are things you can do over the summer to unplug. But in the planning period, we have what are called Use Right Now resources.
Okay.
And so they're really designed to complement the Truth Rising study that I mentioned earlier on our website on colsoneducators.org. And it really looks at 4 different things: hope, truth, identity, and calling. So let's use math, for example, because if you can do math, you can do any of them, right? So with math, like what hope do I have in the fact that math is not something that we have created? It's something that we've discovered. So what does that tell us? Well, math tells us that if there has to be something outside of us that is not evolved, that is a standard to where math works everywhere in all times and in all places. So math shows us that truth is objective. It's not relative. When we look at things like, let's consider identity in math. Well, what virtues Am I cultivating by studying math? Well, I'm cultivating humility as I realize this is hard and I don't know how to do this. I'm cultivating honesty as I'm required to show my work. I'm cultivating perseverance as I just don't want to do these quadratic equations, but I've got to power through. I'm cultivating these virtues inside of me. And then now, if I look at calling, then I can say, where has math been used to promote good? Where has
Mm.
math been used to perpetuate evil? Where has math been used to restore? Where has math been used to promote beauty? In the 90s, fractals were all the thing until people realized this is just a math equation that's done over and over. And so, as we look at those four different buckets, if you will, of hope, truth, identity, and calling, now we can go into English literature. Where is hope seen in this passage? Where is what is good that's being celebrated here? Where's the relationship between the individuals? And all those are worldview questions because they get to, well, wait a minute, if we believe that humanity is inherently good, then this is how this will play out. If we believe that humanity is inherently sinful, then this is where this will play out from an English perspective. We've put together some resources on grammar. Like, why is it that we want sentences to be well written? What does it tell us about order? What does it tell us about virtue and humility? What does it tell us about identity formation? Where has language been used to promote what's good or pursue what is evil? So all those used right now resources, we're going to have those available on the Colson Educators website. You can get them in the planning period newsletter, but they're not inherently religious in nature. They're questions about a worldview. Yes, we're going to provide discussion points on how you could do this in a Christian context. But
Mhm.
those questions, you can ask questions of where has math been used for evil? And then now you have to define the question or the term evil. And now it's a
Oh, yeah.
worldview formation exercise.
Okay. Wow. Wow. All these ideas. This is exciting. I hope listeners are getting excited about some new thoughts for next year. Sounds like there's tons of resources to check into depending on whatever subject you teach. There's something. How can teachers cultivate critical thinking without losing biblical grounding?
That's a really good question. And we have to cultivate critical thinking by starting at the position that all truth is God's truth. What has happened over the last, I would hate to say 100 years, it's probably been more than that, is that we have found ourselves in a culture that says there are public truths and there's private truths. It's really what Francis Schaeffer referred to as the facts value split, that the public truth is anything that's proven by science. And if it's not proven by science, then that's your personal opinion. And you're welcome to have that personal opinion, but don't try to enforce it on anyone else. So you get this dichotomy between, well, that's a religious truth versus a scientific truth. Well, the problem is that whole paradigm is not proven by science. And so therefore, by its own setup, it would be somebody's personal opinion, which means I don't have to believe it if I don't want to. But we live in a world in which that so much of that has just been assumed into our culture that to really get at critical thinking, we have to start with, okay, so are there absolute truths? Are there truths that are true no matter who you are, no matter where you're at, no matter when you lived? And if so, how do we know those are true? And then we
Mhm.
begin to ask those questions that I mentioned of the college that the College Board provided us with earlier. When you look at this, what is the author's main idea, argument, or thesis? And is there, when we look at the line of reasoning, are they assuming things that they cannot assume, like that words mean the same thing, or that this is where you get into classic like logic and you get into these different syllogisms and stuff like that. And you don't have to go that deep into it, but cultivating an idea to where students will be able to say, okay, is this true? And how do we know it's true? And upon whose authority? And then begin to move forward and not accept the lie that there's public truths and private truths are just opinions.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it kind of gets out of that place of how our culture has so been, well, your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth. And then it just becomes a big mosh of what in the world do we land on?
That's right. And we love to
Ah,
give lip service to that because it sounds really good. But when I get on an airplane next Monday and I fly to Colorado, I don't want the engineers who have developed that plane and everything else to believe that truth is relative. I want them to have known, okay, so here's what thrust is, and here is what it requires to get this plane off the ground, and here's what it requires to land the plane. So we can give lip
yeah.
service to truth being relative all day long. And here's what's encouraging: our young folks are getting tired of this because
Hmm.
they know that relative truth is not livable. It's not
Hmm.
livable to say what's true for you is true for you and what's true for me is true for me. And unfortunately, if you're a teacher that's listening to this podcast and you teach humanities, Do not ask the question, what does this text mean to you? Ask the question, what does this text mean to what did this person mean what do you think they meant when they wrote this text? How it applies to you can be completely different. But we have unfortunately adopted that method into Bible study as well. And so now we go, well, there's all these different truths. No, there's one truth. When Emily Dickinson wrote that poem, this is what she meant. Here's how we can apply it, but she meant something when she wrote this. And we can't get away from that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a very good reminder. So, what would you say to a teacher who feels like I can't talk about faith in my school with regard to worldview?
Yeah, sometimes it's not what you say, but it's how you live. And now, again, I'm not a big fan of the lifestyle evangelism that I will live so piously that people will ask me exactly. Now, how I handled difficulties, yes. When my parents passed away, how did you walk through that? And I was able to say, because here's what I know to be true. But when we're looking at a public school, how do you cultivate a love of truth? How do you cultivate students to be truth lovers and truth pursuers? And then, just like I was having a conversation with my son this morning, who's 5, and he called a road the wrong road. He goes, we could call it this way instead. And I said, no. I said, buddy, we have to call things what they are because that is true. And when we don't call things what they are, then that's not loving. That's not loving to people. That's not loving. It doesn't represent God well because these are things that are true. And so if you're a public school teacher and you're going, how do I integrate this in? Become a person who loves truth. And when they ask you questions of, well, why are you so hard on us about making sure that we're getting things right? Because I want you to have the true story of reality. Well, where do we know the true story of reality? And you've got to be careful in how that you address some of these, because no matter where you're at, different school systems are going to have different abilities and different. I had an administrator that was like, well, I worked in a public school setting in South Carolina, and I started every faculty meeting off with prayer. And I said, well, I might get fired for this one day, but I'm not going to get fired for it today. You don't have to verbalize your prayers. You can pray for students, but how you live your life out as a teacher and you model love and compassion and the pursuit of truth. And when you seek to, probably one of the easiest ways to do this is when you are dealing with behavior issues, are you approaching those from a punitive or from a restorative perspective? Am I just trying to dole out punishment because I'm the teacher, or am I trying to find a way to restore you in those 4 relationships, ultimately to God, but restore you to one another, restore you to yourself, restore you to creation as a whole?
Yeah, which kind of goes back to your leadership, that thing you said earlier too, coming in a place of humility rather than lording it over people. How do we execute that as a teacher when we're teaching, that we're not just the doler of knowledge, but we're actually teaching in a way very much like you're saying, a worldview, like how am I treating you shows what I believe too.
Yeah, and I'm not saying to compromise on your convictions by any means. Please do not do that.
Mhm.
But you got to know, you have to be wise
Yeah.
into which hills am I going to die on.
Yep.
And so wisdom and how that we approach and how we educate and how that you can still use a model of pedagogy that's in alignment with the Christian worldview that's going to hit all these different components of us as individuals that are thinking, being, and doing individuals. You can have curriculum, but if you have curriculum and not a well-formed teacher, then the class is going to be terrible. And so, as I mentioned earlier, when you as the teacher are the worldview, you're the person who's going to communicate the worldview. The way in which you teach, even if you graduated from a secular school, the way in which you teach communicates something about a worldview. And so, if you teach from a Christian pedagogy, even though that your curriculum might be secular, there's going to be truth that comes through in that.
Yeah. Yeah. Which kind of leads me to, we're starting to wrap up a little bit here. I've got a couple more questions, Billy. And one of them is, we're at the end of the school year. Some people have already finished and others are wrapping up. What encouragement would you give to a weary teacher who loves Jesus but is feeling really overwhelmed right now?
Mm. Your work matters immensely. And the reason that you're overwhelmed right now is because your work matters immensely. And you know that, and that you have invested. A lot of people go, oh, I wish I could be a teacher because I get 2 months off in the summer. Well, that's because they're pouring their lives in much more than what they would do on a traditional 12-month schedule. And so you're at the end of the road, but God has sustained you and he will sustain you, and that your work matters in the scope of eternity. You may not see the benefits of that tomorrow or next week or next year or next graduating class or when those kindergarten you're teaching now graduate in 12 years or in the school that I was at in 13 years for some of those students. Your work matters from an eternal perspective, and that God has ordained that you are here in front of these students during this time, in this place, at that school, and he's given you what you need to flourish. And again, those identity pieces we talked about, those questions that we talked about, I hope that you find those encouraging, because what you're doing as an educator is replicating who you are. And that is, we all have a teacher that we could look back on, or a number of teachers that we could look back on and said, that person makes the difference in my life. And that's why we all love Mr. Feeney from Boy Meets World, right? Because we see the trajectory of how he influenced those, even though it was a fictional show, there's so much truth there. So remember the love that you had for why you became an educator, and remember your love for Christ, and that while you may not see the benefit, Romans 8:12, we see that he's working all things together for good for those that love him and are called according to his purpose.
Yeah, that's good. What do you believe God is doing in education in this season?
Oh man, that is a really great question. And here's the thing, and I don't want to discourage our public school friends. There is a movement in Christian education right now that is just happening, where it's going to be a challenge for Christian schools, because we have such an exodus from public schools in some of the things that we have seen, to where Christian schools, they have to be very careful and very intentional about, okay, what does my admissions process look like?
Yeah.
Because many families who aren't even believers are trying to get into Christian schools because they're tired of what they're seeing in some of the public school systems.
Yeah.
However, that doesn't mean that we should flee the public schools either. Yes, God has called some of us to be Christian teachers and in Christian schools, and God has called some of us to stay right where we are as missionaries. But here's the thing, if you're in that context, you must be ready. You must be wise. You must know what the essence of your worldview is, what the Christian worldview is, what the other worldviews are, and how to engage with them, because God has put you there for a purpose. But you need to make sure that you're well equipped to handle those things, and not for the purpose of winning an argument, but for the purpose of winning a person with grace and with truth and with love. And what happens is that many times we will feel the brunt of that. We may be ostracized in certain ways, and we have to be okay with that, because we trust that God has put us there for a purpose. That's one of the things I love about the Truth Rising documentary that we put out. If you watch it, you see the story of Jack Phillips, who said, you know what, I'll serve you any sort of cake, but I'm not gonna bake a cake for a same-sex marriage, because this is what I believe. And who would have known, who would have ever dreamed that years later, one of the what Richard Dawkins had named his protege as the next leader of the new four horsemen of the atheism, a lady by the name of Ayan Hirsi Ali. Who would have known that she would have came to faith? And really, Richard Dawkins flipped out about this. He was like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Who would have known that she would have came to faith? And when you ask her what moved you to faith, she said, I heard about this guy in Colorado who's a cake maker.
Wow.
15 years ago. You would have never imagined that. And stand your post, lead with love, lead with truth, lead with grace, lead with humility, and let God take care of everything else.
Wow. That's so
I know that
good.
probably didn't answer what's going on in Christian and education a whole lot, but we're seeing a movement into Christian education. We're seeing a movement outside of a public school. Don't be discouraged by that. That gives you an opportunity, because so many people are upset with what's happening in public schools, whether it be from gender ideology or bathroom laws or whatever. And that gives us a really great position to lead with grace, with truth, with love, with humility, and to stand up for what is right, even if it means that we have some financial sacrifices that are made for that.
Yeah. Yeah. And Billy, we've had a number of people on this season in particular who have really been challenging our listeners to make sure we know what God's asking us to do. Because it is important in this time in this season to be moving in wisdom. Revelation 1 7, or excuse me, Ephesians 1:17, to know that we've been given the spirit of wisdom and revelation, and asking the Lord for continually for that as we face each day, to know what our positions are. Because some people are shifting within public education, and some people are called to be done, and that it's okay, and to honor what people are being directed to do and support them in that place. So we appreciate what you guys are doing at
That's
Colson.
right. And
Yeah.
Jessica, I don't want to get into the political realm, but if you're a teacher in a Christian school or you're a teacher in a public school, you need to vote. in your school board elections, because that is what's
Yeah.
going to change what happens in there. We think of, yeah, we're called to vote and exercise our right to vote at a national level, and we certainly are. And many times people forgo their local elections, but your local election on your school board will play a role in what happens in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Billy, before we wrap up today, I just want to say thank you. Thanks for joining us today, but for the work you guys are doing at Colson Educators to strengthen teachers and help them think deeply about what it means to live from a Christian worldview in education. This is really important work, and it's just encouraging to hear. And I hope, listener, you felt that way as well. I know so many educators listening are trying to faithfully follow Jesus increasingly in this complex environment of education. And we appreciate the clarity, wisdom, and encouragement that you've shared with us today. So thank you so much. That it's a real gift to get to have this conversation. I want to ask for one more question before we close. How can teachers stay anchored in truth and courage when culture feels confusing or pressured? I think this is a big one for them.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it leans right into our mission statement at the Colson Center. So at the Colson Center, our mission is to provide Christians with the clarity, confidence, and courage they need to live as Christians in this cultural moment. So whether you are an educator and you go to Colson Educators, and we have those courses that are online for free that you can take that will equip you how to see through those things, or you just simply listen to our Breakpoint podcast, or you go to colsoncenter.org and you see the resources and articles that we have up there to provide clarity when we need clarity on what the Bible may teach on things, or cultural issues when we need confidence, when we need courage. Whatever you need, we're going to have those things for you. And we also have our Colson Fellows program, which is a 10-month deep dive into worldview formation. And so you can check all those things out from colsoneducators.org, colsonfellows.org, and you can just go to colsoneducators.org/KE. And that way we'll know that they came from Kingdom Educators, or colsonfellows.org/KE.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Billy, we're so grateful. Remember, today we've been chatting with Billy Hutchinson, Director of Colson Educators at the Colson Center. And the Colson Center exists to equip Christians with the clarity, confidence, and courage they need to live like Christians in this cultural moment. So if you found this podcast episode encouraging or resourceful, be sure to share it with a friend or a colleague. So we'd love for more people to hear about the work of Kingdom Educators and the resources available to you as an educator at the Colson Center. So to learn more about the Colson Educators, to learn more about how Colson Educators can help you bring a Christian worldview into the classroom, be sure, like Billy said, to visit colsoneducators.org/KE. And for more free resources to help you live like a Christian, visit colsoncenter.org. And in the show notes, all this information will be provided, as well as the Colson Center social media handles. So thank you so much for joining us this week, Kingdom Educators, and we look forward to you joining us again next week.
Thanks for tuning into this podcast. Please be sure to rate, review, subscribe, and share with your friends in education so they too can be strengthened and encouraged in living their kingdom identity out loud in this pivotal hour. And please visit kingdomeducators.com to receive your Kingdom Educator Daily Truth Declarations, my encouraging newsletter, and be the first to know about my newest resources online and in-person events. And be sure to find me on the socials at kingdom.educators. Until next time, don't forget you are a history maker, and what you do every day is transforming lives.